what is behavioral economics to you? How should we think about the field?
Sure. So, don't know if this would be a textbook answer, but to me, I think of it as sort of a merging of what we've typically done in experimental economics, trying to bring the tools of experimental science to understanding behavior, and mixing that with some of the insights from psychology that would tend to challenge typical assumptions that it's not that we always believe these assumptions in economics, like, for example, people are, perfectly rational. I don't think that everyone really believes that, but that's, been sort of the standard or the baseline way to start off with the modeling. And of course, in psychology, they would recognize that there's, seemingly irrational sorts of behaviors made for this, that, or the other reason. There's decision biases and these sort of psychological phenomena getting incorporated into how we think about economic behavior and how incentives matter and things like that are what I see. So I see it as sort of a mixing of behavioral psychology and experimental economics, and look at it that way.
Interesting. It's helpful, interesting that you'd bring up that economists might often think about people as being perfectly rational and selfish, but they might not necessarily believe it. But it's perhaps, and let me know what you think, kind of a useful model to like think about how and why people might differ from that. But I'm just wondering how useful is that as a framework? Is that what does behavioral economics bring and change from those assumptions, and what do you think is sort of happening now and going forward? How are those assumptions in economics changing?
Think it can help describe behavior a bit better because when you think of how individuals may care about fairness or other people's outcomes as opposed to just one's own outcome, for example, then that seems to match behavior better in simple allocation tasks where you make a decision as to how much of a certain monetary sum you want to share with someone else. We see evidence that people, even when they're able to take everything for themselves, they often don't. I mean, some do, but there's a non-trivial number of people that are willing to share with others, and at its simplest level, that doesn't fit at all with the money maximizing, perfectly, rational and self-interested economic person, right? So I think it's in the interest of helping better describe behavior, and I think that's largely how. I'm not a theorist, but I think that's largely how theorists approach things. Is they have their simplifying assumptions so that they can have a framework and model behavior, and it does or it doesn't predict behavior well, and to the extent that it doesn't, that you try to find, what is it that is leading to that, prediction failure, and then try to improve the theory. And so that's how I think some of these insights, the creative and skilled theorists can then incorporate some of these psychological insights into theories, and I think we all win then because we have a better decision framework to try to predict behavior.
I One thing I've been thinking about recently is how, because people can criticize economics and that it would have a kind of, in the past, a framework of people are selfish and they're rational, and but then we kind of see that that's wrong, so to speak, when we do a lot of experiments in the lab. But sometimes it's also helpful to have different voices sort of taking different sides. Psychologists saying, no, we really need to think about social motives or what's going on in someone's mind, and an economist sort of taking the other perspective, because then you can kind of better help get the mix of it. But I wonder though, why do you think economics started where it did, at least, or like came to that sort of in the 1800s, sort of thinking of people as completely rational, given that other sciences didn't necessarily think of that? Why start there?
Yeah, a good question. I hadn't really thought of that much. I'm wondering if it's partly because of the mathematical approach that was taken to modeling behavior that was more rigorous than some of the other disciplines, and to make the math work out well, you often go a bit overboard on the simplifying assumptions, at least to start. And yeah, and so as a starting point, you look at how microeconomics is taught, and but I'm also not a macroeconomist, so maybe I'm off here, but it seems to me that you have a bit more ebbing and flowing of how uh, theory is approaching the world of macroeconomic phenomenon, but by and large, the microeconomic decision frameworks are relatively unchanged in terms of utility or some function maximization subject to a constraint. It seems like these are the sorts of things that just fit really well with mathematical tools that economists sort of borrowed from other disciplines, where we just want to do constraint maximization, and if we can fit things into that world, then we know how to do the math, and until something comes along that really begs us to enrich that, or change what that function is, we just keep sort of flexing the theoretical muscles with what we know or what theorists know, and I say that fully understanding that there's theorists that are working hard and have done a lot to uh, to branch out of traditional utility maximization. So, but I teach a microeconomics component to at least a couple classes, and it's still the usual sort of thing that we would see in intermediate or advanced microeconomics, where we have a utility function that's well behaved, and these sorts of things that are aligned with that old school approach to maximizing some satisfaction function, and you've got a constraint, and there you go.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting that you'd bring up that mathematical past
Mm.
over the last couple of centuries,
Mm.
because if you're trying to bring in the kind of
Mm.
psychological nuances and complexity that we might think is more important and irrelevant today in the past couple of decades, that brings a lot of mathematical complexity, right? And you're always going to face trade-offs, I mean, in some senses, I kind of sometimes see economists as just really hoping that these other sort of things didn't matter. If we just, because it's really kind of, you could say, annoying that that you have these, like, oh, people are loss averse, and then, oh, we find this and that weird thing. Oh no, now more and more the complexity of the models build up, and so you're just really like trying to trade off. Okay, what exactly is the most important things that we're finding, so that we don't have to sort of change this, as you say, that classic background of maximization based on constraints too much. Interesting.
think I think the classic maximization point was whenever that started to get incorporated into the way we approached microeconomics. That I mean, these are all really interesting historical points to be made, because if you dial back further and you go back to the 1770s with Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, I mean, it's very much recognized that there's more to what's going to promote this or that behavior than just self-interested, um, money maximizing behavior. I mean, I think it's very clear that there's a morality component to it. There's a social norms component to it. So, but that was at a very non-mathematical point in the or the economic philosophy era of history. But that that's about it on my history there. But
Yeah, yeah.
that'd be my take on it.
I think I kind of want to take sort of, now that we broadly have a conception now what behavioral economics is, what it's trying to
Mhm.
do, and just go into your work and what you've been bringing to the table. And I'm wondering, so well, I don't know what would be an interesting place to sort of start here, but one interesting thing I've loved reading about in your work is the confirmation bias, and trying to understand sort of the mechanisms by how that's working, why and how we have that. So tell me about that, and what you've been finding about it.
So the so this confirmation bias uh, really speaks to how we live in in echo chambers, and we kind of promote things that will maintain ourselves in our echo chamber. So my interest in it came from first seeing some of the political partisanship that was going on in the U.S. The last few years. And so I wasn't terribly familiar with confirmation bias research before then, but there's a fair amount of it, of course, in the world of political science also, where people are looking at how, a particular ideology will lead you to then view arguments presented that oppose that ideology as flawed or more weak, or perhaps also you might choose to not even expose yourself, if you're able, to arguments that challenge your ideology. And so it's interesting because in the world of decision biases, I think the general sense is that we would fall prey to a decision bias if we're not thinking enough about the decision task at hand. But this confirmation bias actually seems to be something that is almost enhanced by thinking more about the issue, which is a bit curious as far as decision biases go. And there's some people who've done theoretical work that would show, this is a bias that kind of gets sustained if you have, a self-reinforcing type of process that is, really protecting yourself from cognitive dissonance in a sense, which is something that psychologists would know quite a bit about. But one of the more interesting theoretical treatments I've seen lately that would help explain this is this idea that you can you derive some utility, some satisfaction from your particular belief structure or your ideology. And so, of course, you may derive some utility from being accurate also in terms of whether you believe a position is valid. But to the extent that you derive some just direct utility from being a conservative or a liberal in the political world, or a Christian or an atheist in the religious beliefs world, if you derive some utility from that belief ideology in and of itself, then that can lead to a predictable bias in how valid you view opposing arguments. And so you can get that sort of predicted behavior, and so I've had a little bit of interest in looking at confirmation bias in a few different domains. I mean, my sense is that it has to be a decision in a domain where people have an emotional stake in their ideological belief. And so, your belief about whether, I don't know, playing cards is a useful pastime or not. I mean, if you don't have a lot of emotional stake in that, that's probably not something that you'd want to use to assess confirmation bias. But these really heavy hitting emotional areas like politics and religion, and I've looked also a little bit at dietary ideology. Whether believe that the food's taste or its healthiness should be what drives your choices. So things like this is where I've tried to explore a bit this confirmation bias, and at least found some evidence. Sometimes it's looks a little bit different in terms of how it manifests, because as I noted, you could have it manifest in terms of how you expose yourself to information that opposes your belief system. Or you could just, when you're forced to be exposed to opposing viewpoints, you just discount the validity of those viewpoints, and yeah, so that's been
Yeah.
interesting.
Interesting. So I guess if I'm understanding your thinking, it's that the more important that a belief and opinion is to us, the more we're gonna derive, either like, pleasure from keeping it, or just like
Mm-hmm.
we're really gonna hate trying to get rid of that, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like gonna just be too much work almost. That's gonna upset too many other things, and then and that makes sense. And I guess on that last point, you're saying, okay, what how exactly is that working? Perhaps it could be they just almost in a way kind of trying to ignore straight information, so they're not taking it in, or if they do take it in, there's some way in which they're viewing those arguments differently and not thinking of them as valid. Interesting.
Right.
Um,
And I think the reason I mentioned, that there's a connection with this cognitive dissonance, this concept of cognitive dissonance, is because uh, in one of the recent projects, I, I looked at um, self-reported mood response after being presented with these arguments in a confirmation bias sort of setting. And so the thinking is that, the more strongly held are your ideological beliefs, then when you see something that is contrary to those beliefs, you'd have a stronger emotional response. It'd make you, more upset or so. So we'd predict that you'd have a negative affective response, which we see in the data. But then it seems that emotional response also helps predict the degree to which you display confirmation bias. So that's sort of in line with this thinking that the confirmation bias is really a type of self-protection mechanism. And because we display it to maybe a greater extent when we have a stronger emotional response, which is almost like a, a biomarker. I mean, to be fair, it's a self-reported emotion, so it's not neural response patterns or anything like that. But it's kind of a behavioral marker for how much stake you have in that particular belief set.
Interesting. There's some work on the confirmation bias in a book called The Enigma of Reason, where
Mm,
these I guess like you could say linguists, they work
mm,
on how and cognitive scientists thinking about that maybe confirmation bias is actually in a way useful in group
mm,
settings because it'd be helpful if we're really good at arguing for our side, so that collectively, because we know that in groups actually we're in a way sometimes often better at solving problems. So if we just gave in to arguments too quickly, that actually might be a bad thing. But I'm just wondering, using this work on cognitive dissonance, where that can go wrong, and for example, if you stop engaging with another side, or you stop considering the arguments at all, then even if in a way sometimes confirmation bias could actually be useful, there are because like very interested in then whether the the ways in which confirmation bias sort of becomes too enhanced and goes too far. And I know you've done some work on like sleep and is that and the confirmation bias, is that right? And what does to us?
So So if you think that there's this feeling that deliberation can enhance the confirmation bias, then the way I sort of brought the sleep question into it was to think of different ways you could proxy the deliberation that someone is able to put into a particular decision task. And so that's where sleep in those projects, I think it was just self-reported sleep as opposed to some of the manipulated levels of sleep that I've looked at in other studies, but I proxied deliberation by being less sleepy, or by having a greater degree of cognitive reflection as gets measured in a task that kind of assesses whether you quickly respond or whether you kind of hold back from giving a knee-jerk response that might be intuitive but wrong, and you actually stop and think about it, as well as just also asking whether you've put a lot of thought into this area. I think it did that for like the dietary choices, for example. Um, I think if when I've had data enough that's broad enough on the age range of the participants, also I've even used age as a proxy for deliberation. Like presumably you've thought maybe more about the healthiness versus tastiness of food. If you're an older individual compared to a younger individual, just by virtue of having years of experience, and so the sleep was really just a proxy for
It's
deliberation. Yeah.
I see, interesting, and the
Mm,
more that people deliberate, the
mm,
more confirmation bias they can often have. So
mm.
how do we then overcome confirmation
Well,
bias?
I think part of the key, yeah, is given the more recent work that where I looked at the mood response as possibly moderating this effect. That therein might lie some of the potential to help, is to recognize that, if we can sort of keep people from having such a strong, so maybe this is, gets at trying to talk people down from the emotional ledge, in some of these heated debates, but but the emotion seems to crowd out, the ability to process maybe an opposing argument for its merits. Because I do think some other people have looked at least in some of this confirmation bias work, whether the individual is actually willing to entertain opposing ideas or not. So you can imagine someone might identify as a political conservative and they're actually willing to entertain, all ideas and arguments, but someone else might be very clearly, closed off to those other. So there's a certain, strength, of how firmly entrenched you are in a particular ideology. But again, I think that my guess is that's likely to manifest via the emotional response when you're presented, with the opposing arguments. And so it is a tough one, but I think the emotional response is probably a useful starting point to try to understand what could help, mitigate it.
I see. So would you say maybe that regardless of the person, I mean, in general, there's some way in which negative emotions make
Mm-hmm.
it worse. So,
Mm-hmm.
and you could say that as well, though, if you are someone who is more deeply entrenched in an idea, that could also lead you to have more negative emotions as you encounter ideas. That's so interesting. That's the mediator, the mechanism, perhaps, or one important one for why the confirmation bias sort of comes up for the ideas that we hold.
So
Um,
I'm thinking,
yeah. Um, Another area I wanted to ask you about
yeah.
was the link between personality traits and economic theory. You have some work on dark triad traits and then trying to think about lack of prosociality and things like this. So maybe tell me a bit about that paper. It's an introduction to just trying to think about the relation between these two areas.
So, I can't quite recall what got me interested in these. I mean, I came across a paper, I'm imagining, in a psychology, journal or something, but, um, so so I have this project where the individuals go through this validated set of personality questionnaires that assess whether, you're high or low on not only dark personality traits, which the classic triad is this, and they say these are subclinical measures of sadism, for example, and psychopathy and Machiavelli. Well, the sadism is an add-on. So the classic triad is, I think, narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy. Or actually, I presented this once in a psychology department, and they say psychopathy. So I don't know if I should be saying psychopathy or psychopathy, but, and then sadism, is a more recent subclinical measure of sadism, gets added to make it a dark tetrad, if it were. But I came across this paper that also presented, a more, recent measure of a light triad set of personality traits. And so then that got me a little bit interested in the distinction between the light and the dark, because one of the things I saw in this paper was that, in fact, many individuals display traits, that are both light and dark. It's not so much an all or nothing, but people, you know, relatively were scattered more in the relatively lighter, quadrant of this, you know, dark and versus light sort of a set of axes. You can imagine where people line up, they should be in one corner or the other if it's all light or all dark, but it really wasn't like that at all. So anyway, they
Well,
do
well,
these.
well,
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
what would the light triad be? So they're just kind of the opposite of these other like Machiavellianism and psychopathy.
Yeah, so they're referred to. There's, one set of questions that measures what they call, faith in humanity. You know, do you believe in the inherent goodness of people and things like this are the questions. Faith in humanity, humanism, and Kantianism, like from Immanuel Kant.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, so the questions are more, getting at those dimensions of personality. And there's, you know, I don't know, a handful of questions for each of those personality traits, even in the short form. It's not long at all, but and you do get people who are more light tend to be less dark and vice versa. But the fact that there is a mix within there is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah. Oh, so if I understand it right, so I mean, you could see someone that's actually kind of high in the dark triad traits, but also somewhat high in the light triad simultaneously, and so there's like
Sure.
maybe not necessarily a complete trade-off
Right.
between them. So that's interesting. So
Right.
what did you
Right.
find
So
with that?
yeah, yeah. So on the behavior side, then, in that same study, the participants went through a set of tasks that could get at moral choice to some extent. So there's a well-known task in the behavioral economics literature that has individuals flip a coin in private, and payoff depends on whether you report heads or tails. Of course, if it's in private, as this was an online study, I have no idea what your coin flip was. I actually asked them to flip it 10 times and tell me how many heads they flipped. And of course, you get paid more for every head you report. So, there's a monetary incentive to lie about that. And technically, I can't, it's possible to flip 10 heads out of 10, and you're not lying, but we know at least the statistical properties tell us that we should expect five on average. And so we can get a sense, at least on the statistical side, of whether more dark personality traits tend to be cheating more on that task versus not. We actually also capture their response time in that task. And so we've done this task in the lab previously where people are actually given a coin and they're actually flipping it. And so, we can create an empirical distribution of how long the task should take them to complete if they're actually flipping a coin. So we also know that there's people who are clearly not flipping the coin, and so in a sense, that'd be another measure of whether they're not doing what was asked, or and that not flipping the coin correlates with a large number of heads flipped also. So clearly there's some funny business going on there. So there's that task. There's also a trolley dilemma task, which is this typical moral dilemma thought experiment. I don't know if you're familiar with the trolley dilemma, but you've got, five people are going to be run over by a runaway train. No one ever asks why they're on the track, but they're on the track, and but you can choose to pull a lever, for example, and it diverts the train to a side track. So those five people are saved, but unfortunately, anyone on the side track, and there may be a person there, will die. And so typically there's more people saved than lost, but we can vary the scenarios so that there's the same number, or possibly if you divert the train to the sidetrack, no one dies. And I mean, it's clearly a hypothetical choice task, but it's like quite popular in business ethics courses, and just as a way to stimulate thought about these difficult moral trade-offs. It's not necessarily a right or wrong, but when we incorporate sort of unique scenarios like five people on the one track, no one on the side track, clearly it'd be a bit more questionable behavior whether why you wouldn't possibly want to divert the train so that no one dies and everyone's saved. But we do find the sadists are more likely to not divert the train. And so there does seem to be a connection. Typically you'd say uh the utilitarian person who just wants to save the most lives is going to pull that lever. But, it is a moral dilemma, because you then know that you're directly responsible for killing someone, as opposed to if you just let things happen, then it's a passive responsibility that we view differently in terms of moral responsibility and all that. So the dark personality traits tend to cheat more on the coin flip task. They tend to make some more of these kind of odd and more unambiguously immoral choices, even in this hypothetical dilemma. And then they also go through a set of allocation tasks, which get at the prosociality directly, because you're choosing to allocate funds between yourself and someone else. And so there's a very nice task out there in the literature called the social value orientation task, which produces a measure of how pro-social you are, and the dark trait types are clearly less pro-social. So So yeah, and these are all
Interesting.
sort of building block behavioral environments that mean something for decision making in more complex situations that we'd encounter in everyday life.
Interesting. I mean, so it might not have been something you covered in that study, but
Mhm.
do you have any sense for why dark and light triad can they you could be high in both dark triad but also like light triad? Is there maybe some other factors that influence both? And I'm just wondering why that seeming paradox would exist.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it is true that you're not going to find people who are at the top of the scale on both light and dark. It's more that, you have some sort of, I don't know, and to me, it's a little bit almost what you would expect if you understand human nature. There's a little bit of angel and devil in everyone to some level, and I think we recognize that with the struggle that many of us have just with everyday choices and situations. But yeah, um,
Yeah, interesting. I mean, one thing is that it's kind of you can imagine that on certain tasks, people's natural proclivities to, say, some Machiavellianism or a negative kind of
Mm.
trait are sort of pushed and but then in other scenarios actually again other sides of their nature kind of come out, so it's not necessarily that on all kinds of tasks and in all circumstances those dark triad traits would manifest fully, right? And so yeah, interesting.
Exactly to certain decision environments as it would be to others. I mean, the Machiavellian thrives in an environment where there's the ability to sort of strategically manipulate the situation or people to get what you want. And so, yeah, if it's a individual decision making environment that is really sort of detached from those strategic concerns, then you wouldn't expect that it should play a big role in that.
Have you done any thought into thinking about the big five personality or more general factors of
Mhm.
personality and say how economists might test those in lab settings, and also as economists, yeah, we will run games or even think about risk preferences. How much do they like different like lotteries and in sort of pure monetary terms, and how should we think about their relation to the big five?
There has been actually a lot of interest in the Big Five on the psychology side, um, Big Five and ethical choice, as well as other choices. So I'm not so familiar with what they found in terms of individual decision making, like risky choice, things like that. But there are some of those Big Five traits that do tend to predict ethical choice, or at least, and sometimes this is ethical choice in a non-consequential environment in some of these behavioral psychology experiments. But we actually do collect the Big Five in that same study where we have the dark and light personality triad as well. And so when I say that the dark and or light are predicting behavior, it's over and above what any Big Five trait is predicting. Now, that being said, I think the one trait that tends to be a stronger predictor of ethical choice, um, it's not part of the Big Five, but it's in the hexaco, I think they call it, which I believe is the Big Five, and then, and I may be wrong here, but you add the trait of honesty slash humility. And so obviously a trait that's trying to measure honesty, humility, you'd expect to predict honesty or ethical choices, and it does. So we didn't collect that measure. We just did the Big Five. But all this to say, I think there's different personality constructs that are out there that are all um, trying to understand the larger picture in some related ways. But the idea is, how does personality uh, lead to downstream effects on behavior? And so I don't know that one is better than or worse than another. At the end of the day, we're just trying to find out which ones have that marginal extra predictive ability beyond what we already know. And perhaps in some environments, it may be easier to to know whether someone is a narcissist just from interacting with that person, compared to knowing whether they have a particular um, other trait or a big five trait. So it just may
Right.
be, useful to have a whole basket of these traits that we know lead to this or that type of behavior. And depending on the environment, we may be able to sample information that helps us understand that this trait more, but not the others. But then in a different context, we might get some other information that
Hmm.
helps.
Interesting. So on both the personality front,
Mm.
all the different kinds of measures, but then also even the economics, how people make economic decisions, just which ones can sort of help us to understand behavior and try and discriminate between. Okay, in this context, that measure is quite useful. In this, and not so much, and so not necessarily favoring one or the other, but just trying to think where kind of can they be usefully applied. Interesting. Um,
Say also, some of the interest I found in this in just in writing this paper up has been to notice that there's such a large industry towards personality testing that gets used in occupational settings, and and the interest is in trying to understand things that will be predictive of workplace behaviors, and so the challenge is to understand how you can try to assess someone's key personality traits, but then at the same time, people realize that, if a personality trait's going to be used to decide whether I get a job or get a promote, whatever, then I obviously have an incentive to not be forthcoming when I'm filling out these questionnaires. And so it seems that there's actually, research and work on trying to get past that social desirability response bias complication in all of this. But it's big business, and it's big business in the UK as well as the US, and any place where HR has an interest in trying to understand, what can help predict what my employees are going to do.
Yeah, I mean, as well, it's interesting because if you start using personality traits to then
Mhm.
impacts employment decisions and things, you might want to try and study what personality types have a greater proclivity to lie on personality type things. And I guess it's kind of in a way very related to the what you're doing is, yeah, to what degree are like dark and light triads going to predict behavior in these games of dishonesty and moral behavior. So interesting.
There's been lawsuits over this issue of, whether so this is a so that's not something that I've gotten so much into, but to understand how messy that can get. I mean, there, clearly you can say, if you ask someone, are you a sadist? And they say yes. And you say, well, I know that a sadist is more likely to kind of make these sort of bizarre choices in a moral dilemma environment, more likely to cheat or not do what I've asked or whatever, then I don't want to hire you. But it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. I mean, the questions don't come out and ask, are you a sadist? But, these personality instrument questions, I mean, some of them are rather to the point. If it's asking you whether you enjoy, watching harm happen to other people or something, I mean, you can kind of maybe smell where this is going at some level.
Yeah.
So,
I also wonder if even just as myself answering them, there's also a tendency to be like, oh, I wish I was like that, rather
mm,
than, or so there's a kind of a moral, in yourself, or trying to preserve a kind of self-image sometimes too.
mm,
So not even trying to trick someone else, but kind of just trying to think, well, I don't know, I don't think I would actually do that as you write down the thing, but then what do you actually do in a decision environment might be kind of different to on paper how you answer questions in these kind of personality questionnaires.
you think then, so at the end of the day, right? Though I think most times when people are filling these out, certainly for a study like mine, they don't really have any interest in in lying on the I mean, I'm never going to know who that person is. It's all it's an anonymous participation sort of study. So you'd say, well, they're probably about as valid of responses as you could expect, and so I don't know how challenging that question is among the people that are practically trying to use these in real life occupational settings or someplace where there's consequences, and that there's consequences to your responses, versus doing a survey study. So that's the interesting connection between the lab and the external validity of you're looking at too.
Interesting. Um, what is some of the future research for you going to look like? What questions interest you?
Mhm.
What do you think you're going to be doing in the future?
Yeah, so I I still have some pretty good energy regarding some of this ethical decision making work, and I would like to do some stuff that makes a more strong connection between the sleep research that I've done in the past and the ethical decision making. There's already a robust literature that has an interest in understanding sleepiness and ethics and moral choice and things like that. As with some of the stuff I've done in the past, I think I can bring some new tasks to the table, which means looking at some different decision environments that maybe haven't been explored yet. I think there's interest in things that are interactive decision making environments. Um, so, for example, you could think of work where people have looked at. Uh, there's an interesting paper that looks at sleepy supervisors are more abusive towards their subordinates. Okay, so that's all good, but right, the that's not good, but I mean it's interesting, but the the measures of abuse, supervisory abuse, are often via a self-report questionnaire and things that are maybe not the consequential sort of environments that I'd want to look at for external validity. No reason to think that they'd not be honest on reporting that if these are data collected from actual supervisors in companies and all that. But there's plenty of economic decision tasks that we use that look at simple interactions and look at willingness to uh, sabotage others' work or or present a deceitful message to someone else. And so there's with the little mixing and merging that I've done of those two interested or research areas of interest that I have, the sleep and decision making and the ethical choice. I've really only done one or two things that have connected them. And with what I've done, it was a very limited number of decision tasks, and so there's obviously a lot more rich set of decision environments that get at the ethics of decision making, because there's all sorts of uh, different ways you could construe that. Uh, yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really great
Mhm.
conversation. I appreciate you taking your time. So, is there anything last things you want to say, or
Um, no, I mean, I really appreciate the chance to chat with you, Jack, and um, I think uh, I think there's so many of us out there that are just kind of interested in behavior, and there's lots of interesting questions. And so, to the extent, as you noted way earlier, that we can kind of talk with people from other disciplines, it really does bring some unique uh, thinking to the mix when it's interdisciplinary. Because, as I said, I think a lot of us have similar questions across disciplines, but we just maybe don't always talk to each other across the table as much as we should, and we start to find out that there are methodologies we can borrow from others, interesting concepts of how to approach a decision task that we can borrow from others and work together. I think the interdisciplinary stuff always tends to be a bit more interesting, and so that's been my interest and probably will continue to be going forward. But I do enjoy trying to understand, trying to figure out why people behave the way they do. And yeah,
thank you? Well, I've learnt those. I hope you enjoy this too. So, thank you, David.
appreciate it.